5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Jen, Don, how are you? I'm sorry I'm not there in person. As we speak, or as you're viewing this, I will be at a semi-emergency budget meeting with the fiscal town budget director, as well as the Branford Board of Ed director. Nothing earth-shattering, but we were brought together to talk leasing and budget and preparation for our big Board of Finance presentation on Monday. So again, I'm sorry. I wish I could be there. I would much prefer to be there. But I wanted to do my due diligence and present the information in the chapters that I read. So without further ado, I'm going to get started. All right. As I'm sure Jen mentioned, we split this up. I did chapters 22, 23, 24, and I believe we both did 25. So what I'm going to do is just start with a brief overview of each of the chapters, and then get into kind of what I see as the string that goes through all this. Okay, so first chapter, chapter 22, was Steinkuhler, who I got the pleasure to meet at AERA not too long ago. Her article was entitled Cognition and Literacy in Massively Multiplayer Online Games, or MMOGs as she continually refers to them as. She claims that they are the quintessential online gaming community, or one that when we start talking communities, these are the types of video games, these MMOGs are the ones we should be looking at and researching. She discusses them as a cognitively demanding process to kind of put to rest some of the discussions of the gaming and if it's a legitimate and appropriate topic to be covering in the literacy world. She talks about the exploration under cognitively demanding. She talks about in these MMOGs, the exploration of complex and multidimensional spaces, the empirical model building and systems analysis that game players are taking part in, as well as the negotiation of meaning and values between players and how they're playing games, and then the coordination of resources, whether those are human resources and other players, or in-game resources, or goal attainment, and what have you. So she paints a picture of the cognitive load that takes place in a player as they're participating in these MMOGs. As far as theory goes within the article, she was really had the discussion of the communities around these MMOGs and the cognitive work that takes place was based in this theory of social construction. There's very much a blur between production and consumption in these games, because we often refer to them as playing in these games, but a lot of what they're doing as they play would be considered production or work or cognitive load. She also discusses in depth discourse theory, and I know she and Kurt Squire in the next article are both, I believe, students or disciples of Jim G. And she qualifies MMOGs as a form of discourse. So of course I had to go and brush up on my understanding of discourse theory, and this is what I came across. You should be able to see it on the screen, kind of a working operational definition, but what really helped set it in stone for me, or give me a more concrete example, was this idea of guerrilla movements, and the idea of that depending on the distinct discourse or point of view you may have, that guerrilla movements could be freedom fighters or they could be terrorists. A band of colonists in 1776 could be freedom fighters fighting for a new country, or they could be terrorists committing treason against the crown. So I thought that was interesting. Okay, chapter 23, as I mentioned, was Kurt Squire, which was very similar to Steinkuhler's article in that it takes on video game literacy, and he does get into MMOGs as well. Squire kind of frames his discussion at the beginning as this decline of literary reading and a call to action and his call to action seems to be taking an approach to video games being that call to action, and makes a case throughout and circles back to that at the end. He gets into why games. He discusses how they've matured over time. These are not Space Invaders and Pac-Man anymore. The increasing role of games in society and in young people's lives, typically our target audience for formal education. And the overall general acceptance in society, where we have the sheer numbers of people participating in these types of games, but also the average age of these participants the average age is usually in the mid to high 30s. He goes on to, he kind of framed his paper, Squire did, as a lit review, and he goes through these particular areas, artifacts as social practice, and then he does quite a bit on literacy and education, and gets into a discussion of the appropriateness of gaming and game literacy as instructional tools or skills for students to be working with in a formal, typically public school, younger setting. The specific link to literacy, the quote that resonated with me most was, "Literacies are enacted and legitimized through participation in communities." This seemed to be a theme throughout all 4 articles, and I will get to that at the end. He did also mention that the study of games is similar to the study of other media studies during other generations, be it radio or TV or PCs. Specifically to games, first researchers really attacked or looked at game systems, then they looked at specific game titles, but now they've moved on to this idea of gaming literacy in the context of gaming communities. In the article, he also, again, I believe a student of Jim G, uses discourse theory to study the social interactions in this idea of gaming literacy, and Squire specifically discusses gaming literacy, where Steinkuhler did not. But then also, he gets into this idea that we've talked about before of affinity spaces for literacy development, and affinity spaces as this community that is different from professional learning communities because it has its own characteristics, where it's more of a ill-defined space where different participants with varying degrees of expertise and searching for different goals can cross in and out of this space. So it could be everything from a formal educational setting through an informal, through many different opportunities, again, in contrast to professional learning communities. So that was the Squire article. I guess I should add also that he does mention Web 2.0 quite a bit, and the role that that's playing in the overall literacy community, and then specifically gaming literacy. Okay, moving on. Chapter 24 was Thomas, and the title of that article was Community, Culture, and Citizenship in Cyberspace. Specifically, there were 3 themes in the Thomas article. What is cyberspace? What are communities in this space? And what is culture in this space? Thomas spent quite a bit of time giving us some context and some themes around the research of these particular questions in these areas: power, gender, and relationships, image of self, image of mind, body, and machine, and also some Web 2.0 work within this article. But specifically the affordances that online spaces or communities and how we can represent ourselves, our bodies. There's a discussion of exploration of taking on a different gender or a different background, and how what role they play in communities online and participants online. Okay, first Thomas talked about cyberspace. It was initially seen as kind of an escape from the body, separating the social aspects of community from the physicalness of community. As I mentioned, there was some tinkering with sexuality, lack of inhibitions. and then the norming practices in communities that took place to really provide rules of the road, or the types of the ways of doing business and interacting and communicating in these different communities to limit flame wars and such. Thomas circled back to the importance of body and an interfaced being. So not necessarily a physical body, but often in this case, a good example is an avatar, and what that physical identity, an avatar or a character that's customized, facilitates interactions in a community and can dictate how those interactions take place. They shape one's identity, and which can also then, impact what goals or attitudes or desires, dreams are out of the community and the interaction. And it also can mediate the engagement with the other members of the community. As Thomas moved to cyber communities, it was interesting, was using kind of this concept of communities of practice, where the first two, both Squire and Steinkuhler, kind of moved beyond that with the G affinity space work. The key to this was this idea of connecting with others and feeling a sense of belonging in online communities. So depending on what the community was about or interested in, or what kind of the main themes or goals of the community, the practices of the community took different shape on how to bring people into this idea of belonging to that community. We also saw some examples of cyber communities. There was a long discussion about Harry Potter and the fan fiction, and the massive amount of writing that students were doing as a member of this community, with the amount of feedback they could specifically get from a whole variety of amateurs and professionals and the like. Discussion of the punk rock girl zines and online magazine, and then a discussion on how there's a tendency for this younger generation at this time of this article to really be part of multiple communities and be able to float in and out of those communities and be able to take on the characteristics or the norms of those communities fairly readily. Thomas also discussed some of the obstacles to social change within these communities. This is a list, as you're seeing, types of inequality and divisions being created by these networks. Equality of access, equality of technical knowledge being varied, accuracy of available information, which is an interesting discussion to me, because I thought that as part of the practice of the community would be to really filter that out, or at least have a dialogue around that. And then Thomas also mentions this assumptions that making fast, quick responses may in fact lead to hasty decision making. Again, because this information is captured within this community somehow, whether a message board or however this discourse is taking place, I thought that the experiences I've had have been those often get cleaned up quickly because it's there for everyone to see, and everyone likes to show how smart they are. Anyway, cyber culture and cyber community are really the same thing. At least that was the conclusion of Thomas. And Thomas also discusses Web 2.0 around this idea of creating and building community in Web 2.0. This idea of creating community is inherent to this idea of Web 2.0, and some of the examples were obviously Wikipedia, Delicious, which is no longer really with us, but a social bookmarking site, Flickr, which I know, Don, you're very familiar with, for pictures and community building, and blogging, where blogging I can see as a community building activity. However, it seems to be more of a one-to-many, I guess if you include the comments, not as much, but more of a one-to-many activity as opposed to a affinity space or a community building exercise where you could have that many-to-many relationship. All right, at the end of chapter 24, I thought this was an important quote. Finally, internet research should be focused on contemporary issues of social justice, ways of supporting local communities from education to business, with an emphasis on social inclusion should be explored. And the reason I liked that was because I thought it was a wonderful teeing up for the final chapter, 25, the Bruce and Bishop article, which discussed new literacies and community inquiry, which was all about this idea of a community approach to problem solving through the inquiry process. This was an extremely Dewey heavy, as far as theory goes, heavy chapter, but very interesting. The definition, or the working definition of democracy and progressive education, was discussed at length at the beginning, again related to Dewey. But less this idea of democracy as a purely government exercise for legislating or electing officials, and more of this participatory process of citizens together. And they also talk about how we've evolved from when these progressive educational ideas first came out about 100 years ago, where the main focus or the goals of these communities were the development of engaged citizens, to now we very much focus on this idea of the individual and individualist approach. All right, the method for this chapter 25 was kind of taking these historical models and applying them to these new affordances with the internet and online community building, and it was certainly a lit review of a lot of what's out there. 3 central themes of chapter 25: learning and lived experience, community, and technology. I focused a lot on the community element again. It revolved around 5 specific case studies, a couple of which addressed this inquiry lab idea, which again, I believe more of a 2001 to 2010, there were quite a few universities that were building examples of this community practice of inquiry that different researchers could add to, and a lot of those have been archived and rolled up right now. They also address this gap between this idea of separation between life and formal learning experiences, where the idea was this idea of a community participating in the inquiry process is much more beneficial to the learner, in that these are real-world activities as opposed to the formal learning process, which is too far removed from what's actually taking place or important within the community. 2 generalizations. First, beyond the acquisition of specific skills and knowledge, education entails that individuals develop in a reciprocal relationship with the development of the community and society. And the development of responsible citizens requires a process of community inquiry, one that occurs across people from all occupations, social classes, and in all situations. Okay, to summarize this, or actually I should say define the string. You said that at the beginning, Don, so I'm going to just continue to roll with every week with the string theory. The string of these 4 articles, if I were to pull them together with one word, it would be community, which I find interesting because my personal interests are around community development or learning through a social community online, typically in some type of semi-formalized online learning course or MOOC or what have you. So all 4 of these resonated with me. But whether it's Steinkuhler's take on MMOGs and Squire's follow-up of that, although he gets really into more, both of them discuss this idea of less formal affinity spaces where learning takes place socially. I thought was interesting, again, based on the community interactions. And even Squire specifically addresses this idea of, he starts off by posing the problem of practice being the decline of reading or traditional literacy, but then he talks about at the end this constellation of literacies that learners are participating in as part of an online affinity space or community, and again in these 2 examples around MMOGs. Thomas does an excellent job of kind of rolling out the context elements, the building blocks, if you will, or the variables with that differentiate the different communities and how they are constructed and rolled out, and the learning that takes place. And then Bruce and Bishop kind of pulls that back in together and gave some very detailed, specific examples of communities learning, but through this inquiry process. So 5 specific examples of communities of inquiry. And obviously it was a discussion of the purpose of what these communities are doing, this idea of democracy as more of a participation in society as a informed citizen as opposed to the strong, rugged individual. Okay, so certainly, so to wrap this all up, communities as a social practice of inquiry where the literacies are enacted, legitimized, and spread. My last takeaway is the discussion of new literacies, the teaching of new literacies, the learning of new literacies is greatly impacted by this idea of community, probably more so than almost any other variable that we've discussed or we've been reading about to date. So again, sorry I'm not there. I would love to be, but I hope all is well, and I will talk to both of you soon. Ciao.